Do you want to sew a bit more personality into your food prep? Or maybe you're looking for a quick gift to sew? Shall I show you how to make oven gloves like these? Or maybe like these? Or maybe like little mini ones like these? They're really quick and easy to make, and I'd love to show you how I make them. And don't worry, you don't need to go and download any fancy patterns or anything like that, because I'm going to show you how you can whip up your own pattern right now. All I'm doing is measuring out a big rectangle about 45 centimetres by 18 centimetres, which is about 18 inches by 7 inches. If you're using a fabric that it doesn't matter which way up the fabric goes, you can just cut your fabric on the fold here. So a short side like this would be the centre. But if, like me, you're using a directional fabric where it matters which way up it is, then I'm just adding a little seam allowance at the end, and you can do the same too. So I've added about half a centimetre or quarter of an inch. Then I'm going to curve the corners at the other end. I'm folding it in half lengthwise, so both sides will end up the same. Freehand drawing doesn't always look as perfect, so I'm using the curve of a plate as my guide to make a nice smooth sweep along that last 6 centimetres or 2 inches of the pattern. If I trim that off and unfold it, that's the basic shape already done. Now I need to make matching pockets to be able to put my hands right in, but I'm going to take a little pattern shortcut. I'm just going to mark about 20 centimetres or 7.5 inches upwards, and then I can just fold the rest of the pattern up and out of the way. And look, there's the pocket pattern. To scale it all down for a kid-size pair, I just made my rectangle 27 centimetres by 12 centimetres, which is about 10.5 by 4.5 inches, with a pocket that's about 14 centimetres or 5.5 inches deep. So here's what it looks like all cut out. I've got 2 lots of cotton that I'll join later for the main part, for the front and again for the back. I like to cut these cotton bits generously and I'll trim them back later. Then I've got front and back cotton for each pocket too. I've got 1 long piece of insulating wadding that I've cut out on the fold for the main part, and a piece for each pocket back, and a couple of bonus pieces too. I'm going to use that extra little bit of wadding for being able to reinforce the inside of those pockets where I'm going to be touching something hot, and that'll stop so much heat coming through and make it much less likely to burn myself. Let's get those pockets made up first. I'm putting the pretty sides of the cotton facing outwards, and I've got the wadding in the middle with the fluffy side facing upwards. Then I'm just going to secure all those layers together next. So I've popped an overcast foot on my machine, and I'm using cotton thread to just sew a zigzag stitch all the way around the outside on every edge of both of those pockets. You could quilt these first two if you wanted, but I don't think it's really needed, and I kind of prefer the look without. I'm using cotton for both my thread and my fabric because it's much better at withstanding heat than polyester-based fabrics are. Because the last thing I want is melted oven gloves, right? I'd also avoid any cottons with metallic threads that are woven into them too. They might conduct heat in a way that you wouldn't want them to, and it's just not really worth the risk. Next, I'm grabbing my bias binding, made of cotton again, and I'm just going to add a straight line of it all along the top edges of these 2 pockets, just sandwiching that pocket into the centre of the binding and sewing a quick straight stitch across the top. I've trimmed off the extra binding past that fabric edge after, then that bit's done. Don't worry about those raw edges now. We're going to finish them off later and they won't be visible at all. We're just going to pop that over to the side and then we can move on to the main part. I'm going to reinforce the insides of those pockets first. So I've got the main part of my wadding lying fluffy side up, and I'm layering a pocket-sized extra piece the same way up on top of each end. Then I'm just stitching them in place with a straight stitch all the way around that edge. I've switched over to a thick fabric foot so I can glide over that wadding really easily. A walking foot or a Teflon foot would do the job just as well, or you could always use a regular foot if you're going to be extra careful as you sew. But if you can change your presser foot pressure to reduce that a little bit, that would make it easier too. I'm joining up my cotton for the main pieces next. Just a quick straight stitch, regular seam, nothing fancy here, just so that my overall piece is facing all up the right way. I can get the joint to lay flatter if I just finger press that seam open first. Next up, I'm going to quilt that main section to keep all those fabric layers in place. So to make it easier, I'm using a bit of quilt basting spray. Cotton at the bottom, then wadding, then more cotton and a bit of spray in between each layer. I love using that because it keeps it together really nicely, and then I don't need to use 100 pins and end up stabbing myself all over as I sew. For the top piece of cotton, I like to line up my seam first with the underneath cotton. From there, I can usually match the position better by just smoothing out from the centre. Then all I need to do is add clips all around the edge, and that'll keep it really secure as I sew. I'm using a free motion darning foot for my quilting. I like to start by pulling the bobbin thread up, then holding it out of the way when I start to sew. Because if I've got the bobbin thread pulled up onto the top, I know I can keep it out of the way and there's no chance that it can get caught up underneath and make a bird's nest kind of mess. For my stitching, I'm just following the curved lines of this fabric pattern all the way across it. You might want to sew straight lines on your fabric, or you could even make a whole feature of it by stitching out some fun shapes with a contrasting thread on some plain fabric. For this pattern though, I'm not sure straight lines would look quite as fun. Plus it wouldn't be great to stitch right through kitty faces, would it? Now I'm just going to do that wavy stitching all the way over it. I'm sewing close enough that those stitches will hold everything nicely in place, but not so close that it flattens out the wadding too much. This wadding traps a layer of air inside that fluffy top, and that helps to add even more insulation. So I don't want to overdo it on the stitching and reduce how effective it will be, otherwise it could change how much heat comes through. As much as I've sped this up for you, I find it's best to take my time and to keep it lined up as well as I can as I go. Don't worry if it's looking a little bit scruffy at this point, we're going to sort that. See how I'm just trimming a little bit off the edges? That makes it nice and neat with all those layers lining up perfectly right along the edge. And that'll make it much easier to catch all the edges together when we come to bind it in a minute. To make it even easier, I'm adding a line of stitching all around the edge too, and attaching the pockets onto each end with that same line of stitching. By sewing a straight stitch right near the edge, that stitching won't even be visible at the end. It'll be hidden nicely inside the bias binding. It might seem like an extra step, but I think it's worth it to go around all of the edges and not just the pockets. It stops the underneath fabric layers from folding over without me realising, which means that it could potentially escape out of the binding, and that's such a faff to fix it when it happens, so it's much better to just quickly whip around and avoid it happening in the first place. I reckon that'll do. Just the binding to go now. I like to start with a tail of bias binding not stitched down at the beginning, and that makes it easier to join the ends when I come back around to it. Just like the pocket top earlier, I've got the bias binding wrapped right around the fabric edge, and I'm just sewing a regular straight stitch. I'll be using around 3 meters or almost 10 foot of cotton bias in total for this project. If you're not too confident with adding binding or you want to make it look even more professional, you could use a bias binding foot or iron a centre fold into your binding first, and that'll make it easier to keep that fabric edge right in the centre. I find it best to take my time sewing steadily when I do this, then I can keep the position of the binding more consistent, especially as I go around those curved corners. A gentle pull when I get here on the binding helps me to keep it all look smoother as it stretches out gently and flatter around that curve. Once I'm back towards where I started, I'm going to be stopping short and leaving about 5 to 10 centimetres or 1 inch or two's gap from where I began sewing. If I hold these two bias ends up together, I can see where the point is where they'll need to meet for the binding to be able to sit flat. But I want to sew them right sides together to hide my join, so I'm folding the fabric. Then you see I can flip the binding back to back. I've put a pin where I want my stitch line to be, and then another one either side of it, so they can hold the binding and it won't slip as I sew. Once I have it all lined up under the sewing machine with the needle right over that middle pin, I'll just pull that out and sew a quick stitch forward and backward just to join it. I've trimmed back the excess bias binding and flipped it back over again. Making sure any little bias edges are folded up inside it, I find I can get the join to lay flatter if I just finger press that seam open first. I'm going to straight stitch right over that join and it'll secure it down nicely. I like to add one more step here just to neaten it up a little more. That puffy loftiness of the wadding makes the edge of the binding want to curl up and away from the fabric, and I don't really like the end look of that, so I'm just going to zip around the edge of the binding using a quick zigzag stitch, and that will finish it off nicely. It'll stop it being able to roll back and hold it all neatly in the exact position where I want it. There, much better. Now it's all done and ready to use. What do you think? Would you make one? Or maybe a few? I really hope you enjoyed that, and if you have a go at making your own, I'd love to know how they come out. I'd really appreciate it if you could hit like on the video, and if you want to sew with me again soon, don't forget to hit subscribe. Bye now.